Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, a wealthy patron of the arts, if you were curious at all, coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. But who is here sucking the blood of this innocent from their wrist? Who do I see over there? Who's that?
Well, it is I, depraved little bitch, Steve Guntley. And this is the podcast about decapitated mothers, nasty sunburns, and lots of bodice ripping. That's because this is the podcast about Bloodlust, Subspecies 3, and Vampire Journals, the next two chapters in our ongoing Subspecies retrospective. We're almost done with the series. We've come to an interesting little pocket in the middle as we transition from Full Moon to the Kushner-Locke era with some very surprising and interesting results. And we're excited to welcome back a return guest to talk about these movies. Who's here with us today?
Yes, we have another return guest. Really perfect for this episode because, you know, Subspecies 3, Bloodlust Subspecies 3 is really a continuation of Subspecies 2. And so it would make the most sense to bring back the person that we spoke about Subspecies 2 with on the show. And that person is a writer, filmmaker, podcaster, co-host of the Midnight Mass podcast, and writer and director of Fangoria Chainsaw Awards, Michael Varrati, back to talk more vampire. Michael, you have covered more vampire per mile than anyone with us on the show, so we're happy to have you back again.
Well, I'm excited to be back, and that's a distinct honor. I like having vampire expert on my CV. My curriculum, vampire.
Yes, that's exactly it. Well, we're excited to have you back. We're excited to be revisiting the world of Subspecies, which is we've talked about it before. You know, other than the Puppet Master franchise, this is the franchise that Full Moon treats with the most respect. This is kind of the closest they have to a prestige horror franchise, as silly as it often can still be. But there is an extra level of care and quality that goes into the Subspecies movies that we miss with a lot of other films of this era. So it's always exciting to look back on them.
Yeah, I think what's really cool about these movies, especially this block of them, going from Subspecies 2 into 3, is you can see Full Moon and writer-director Ted Nicolau really embracing the fact that it's sort of like a gothic soap opera, even
Absolutely.
with the fact of Part 2 ending on the cliffhanger, which I think in a post-Marvel, post-Conjuring cinematic universe sort of place, ending a feature film on a cliffhanger is not unusual to modern audiences, but at the time, doing that was sort of not the mode of things. So they really, really anticipated that 2 was going to work. I mean, so much so that they shot 2 and 3 at the same time.
Yeah,
that was a huge gamble. But then to just end 2 on that cliffhanger of Michelle being drugged back into the catacombs and essentially saying to the audience, you want to know what happens? You got to come back. And I love it. I love that that was sort of the gambit and it works.
And they don't do it often, Full Moon, not really. We saw that a little bit with Mandroid and Invisible, where they were kind of trying to tie those two universes together. And that was a more explicitly superhero-themed kind of outing, you know. But yeah, absolutely. It was cool that Ted Nicolau got the freedom to make both of these movies at the same time. That he got to tell one long continuous story. And so that cliffhanger at 2 wasn't just like blowing smoke or like, oh, hope this works. You know, you might see this, or, you know, Mac and me might never return, you know? So, you know, it was cool that they got to get away with that.
It's the video store equivalent of being in the movie theater in 1989 and watching Back to the Future 2 and then seeing the previews for Back to the Future 3 and being like,
right.
Wait, what?
There's already footage. We already made it. I swear to God, this movie exists. You don't have to wait that long. Yeah. And this one wasn't even that long after Part 2 as well. There is a part of my like analytical organizational brain that is just like, oh man, maybe we should have lumped 2 and 3 and then Vampire Diaries and 4 into an episode. And it's like, but I also wanted to give Part 2 its own weight, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was the decision we came to, because I know we had that conversation where we were like 2 and 3 really go together. And then 5 is new and it's a theatrically released full moon movie, so probably warrants its own episode.
Yeah.
And then it was like, okay, well, maybe 4 and Vampire Journals, since they're sort of looked at as either, a
kind of the weird offshoots. Yeah.
like a
they're the
spin-off and
anomalous
a
ones.
spin-off and an offshoot for sure. Like those could have been lumped together. But then I think in doing it, we both realized that we wanted to devote a whole episode to Subspecies 2. And I still think that was the right move. And I'm glad that we scheduled these the way that they did, because we get to continue our conversation about the overall story arc of 2 and 3. And then we get to talk about Vampire Journals after the fact. And so why don't we go ahead and, Steve, why don't you fire off some stats about Bloodlust Subspecies 3 for our listeners?
For sure. That movie was released February 16th, 1994. It's directed and written by Ted Nicolau, and it stars Denise Duff, Anders Hove, Kevin Spiritus, Melanie Shatner, Pamela Gordon, Michael Della Femina, and Ion Hayduk. So like as we discussed in our previous episode on Subspecies, these two were shot simultaneously over the course of one long summer in Romania. If you go back through our back catalog, we've been very lucky to talk to a lot of people involved in the making of these movies. So we have Denise Duff and Kevin Spiritus and Ted Nicolau have all come on our show to talk about their experiences making these. And Denise and Kevin definitely sort of fell in love with each other as best friends over the course of this summer. And they describe it very warmly. And it sounds like it was a pretty great time. I think both movies were shot over the course of 4 months in total, which is, for full moon, a pretty unprecedented length of time.
This is the apocalypse now of full moon movies.
It really is. Yeah. They had to go full native and they had to just go live in Romania for a bit, And it sounds like things were gradually getting better and better in Romania. Ted Nicolau spoke in the first film about how difficult that shoot was. It was just post-war. They were the first American production to ever come into Romania. And it was like herding cats. It was very corrupt. It was still very dangerous. A lot of the crew did not speak English. They did not have a reliable translator. So, but things were gradually improving in Bucharest, and it was making it easier and easier to shoot with a little bit more modern qualities. Not to say that it was still fully modern. It still had a ways to go. Again, listen back to our interview with Denise and Kevin for some grisly stories about some of their hotel accommodations while they were there. But this one is an interesting companion piece in a lot of ways to 2, because there is a world you can see where, if Full Moon were in the business of making 2-hour and 10-minute long movies, you could mash these two films together into one kind of long story, because it does tell the Subspecies 2 to Subspecies 3 is a full arc. And what we're really seeing is kind of two different sides of the story. So the Subspecies 2 is focusing on Michelle and her journey as she's starting to become a vampire. And this one is more focusing on her human friends as they're trying to find her and save her soul. And in a lot of these full moon movies, this could have been a problem, because we've encountered this time and time again. A lot of the leads in these movies can be very stiff and very boring, and it's just not a lot of time to spend. It's not a lot of fun to spend time with the non-villain characters. And I don't think that's the case here. I think Kevin Spiritus and Melanie Shatner are very charming. I think they're very likable. And you do actually care. And it's not a chore to spend time with these guys, even though they're away from a lot of the vampire hunting action.
I'm in agreement with you, although I do think I don't think it takes a ton away, and I don't find it hard to watch, but I do find it a little bit less compelling than the Michelle stuff, which is why I find Subspecies 2 on its own to be a superior in terms of the 2 movies. This part of the story interests me slightly less for stretches of it, not for the whole thing. I think there's moments in here where they really utilize the Romanians shooting locations and stuff really well, like they do in the second movie. It's just a little bit of the human part where they're trying to kind of get in the castle. And then they bring in Bob, who is Benjamin Knight from Mandroid and Invisible, kind of
which I would not have put
from
together.
G.I. Joe.
Yeah, I did not put that together. I didn't know about those movies before watching this the first time. So this is a rewatch. I watched this movie in anticipation of our Denise and Kevin interview. But I agree with you. It's and that seems to be kind of the only real knock that I have against Subspecies 3 is just that it's not Subspecies 2. It's just kind of, it's telling a slightly less interesting story and focusing on slightly less interesting characters, but it's still like this could have been so boring and it could have been so bad, and it's really not. It's a very capable, watchable movie in its
I
own way.
totally agree with you. I just think that the introduction of the character of Bob and some of the stuff with Marin is it's a little tonally sort of different. I mean, I know they're leaning into comic relief and camp a little bit more than they were in the second movie. I mean, Bob kind of comes in like the Tackleberry character. He's got real Tackleberry energy,
right?
I feel like, and with Marin too. I mean, Marin is kind of silly and goofy, a little bit more exaggerated in this movie. I mean, it's not Halloween 5. We don't have the cops walking to their like bumbling slide whistle music like we do in that movie, but it's approaching that. And I think all the dark gothic stuff was my favorite stuff in Subspecies 2. And we get that a lot in the first maybe half hour of this one. And then there's a stretch where I don't want to say it loses me, because that's not entirely accurate, but where I'm not as compelled as I was in the second movie. Michael, you look kind of like you're somewhat in agreement with me. Are you split the difference, or whose side are you on here?
Well, I think that it's curious, because to the point that if these movies had not been split, we probably wouldn't even be having this conversation in this way.
Right.
Because I think that by, compartmentalizing 2 being more about Michelle and 3 being more about the human friends, it creates a separation, even though it's the same story. Whereas if Full Moon was in the business of just making epically long films, like so many people that came after them, and I always have to give credit to Charles Band. I watched Bring Her to Me a couple nights ago, and I was thrilled that it was like, an hour and 5 minutes. And how many of these releases, they're like, we'll make a feature film that's 55 minutes.
Yep.
Get in, have your popcorn, get out. Sort of appreciated to some extent. They don't labor on the fact that it needs to be too long. They trust their audience to appreciate brevity, but it also leads to a moment like this in a series like this, where we probably could have had the continuation and it would have served a story like Subspecies, because when I was last on, one of the things we talked about was Subspecies being the latest in a long line of gothic romance stories that employs the use of vampirism. And if you look at something like Dark Shadows, which certainly is a forebear to this franchise, you have the Barnabas Collins, you have the Angelique and the witchcraft and the vampire and all that's going on. But per every episode, which happened 5 days a week, it was a soap opera, you still had all the human people just wandering around doing their human people soap opera stuff. And because that was all sort of happening at the same time, we could forgive like Joan Bennett wondering how they were going to keep the mansion, because we were also getting Barnabas in equal measure, whereas this splits them. I don't necessarily think the search for Michelle and the human characters are bad. I think it's just the thing is that we're now front loaded with all of the monster and all of the gothic melodrama. So if you're a horror fan who's there for vampires, you're kind of waiting on edge, like, when are we getting back to Radu? When are we getting back to the witch? When are we getting back to Michelle? But I also think it's crucial to have these characters for a number of reasons. And the biggest one is that in the Full Moon Pantheon, we do not always get this level of thoughtful emotional response to the supernatural stuff that's going on. You're just sort of expected to be like, wow, it's horrifying that puppets are alive, or wow, it's horrifying that there is a cookie that's a living serial killer, but we got 55 minutes, so we're just going to get to it. But the fact here is you've got these characters, Mel and Becky, who are actually reacting in a very human way. There's a lot of pathos. She's like, she wants her sister back. She's bereft by the idea that she might have lost her sister, which would be terrible anyway. And then you've got this impossible thing on top of it. And just seeing them process it, seeing them bring in the CIA agent to maybe help out, sort of like in a Taken scenario. But you know that this is not a terrorist, it's a vampire. So good luck there. Right. I think that it's really interesting character work. It's just the character work might be slightly interrupted because of the split of the movies.
I would agree with you, Michael. And you know what this reminded me of? I can remember watching prestige television shows back before the time of streaming and before the time of like things getting dumped entire seasons at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sometimes when you would watch a show, be it The Sopranos, The Wire, something like that, and they would have a really eventful, impactful kind of water cooler episode. And then right after it, the next one would seem sort of
Anticlimactic.
lugubriously paced
Yeah.
and kind of filler, and everyone would be like, wait, well, this one kind of sucked in comparison, and it was always a little overreaction to it. But then when you went back to, let's say, break out the DVD set of the season and you watch the episodes in succession, you go, oh no, this episode is necessary and it serves a purpose. It's just it happened to follow something that was so memorable and climactic and maybe even groundbreaking in a way, although these are definitely hyperbolic talking about a full moon movie, but it's the same feeling. It's like, I think this movie benefits from being watched directly after Subspecies 2.
Yeah.
Because if you watch Subspecies 2 and then months or years go by and then you pop on Subspecies 3, I think these lulls are going to be felt more. Whereas like if you experience it as one story from start to finish, like you can connect more to the human story, I think. And I was getting that feeling of like it as its own, this really doesn't hold up as much as the second. It really needs to be experienced as one thing.
Yeah, but I do want to give it some praise for some of the cool things that it does.
Oh, sure.
You know, like beyond just sort of the weird expansion on the vampire mythos that this series offers. I think in this movie, even more than in the second one, we're seeing a lot more of the humanization of Radu, who is like the most alien kind of creature you can imagine in these series, from his like vocal mannerisms to his fingertips to everything. Everything about him is like larger than life and otherworldly, but they inject a little bit of humanity into him throughout the course of this movie and through his relationship with Michelle, where we can kind of see he's a reluctant tutor, you know. It's like he is granting her this boon, but he knows it's a curse as well. Like he knows that better than anybody. And then just in the human characterizations as well, like you said, Michael, the Becky character has a lot of very realistic pathos for somebody who is like trying desperately to figure out what's going on and to save the person that she loves the most in the world. And I really appreciate the energy that Kevin Spiritus is bringing to this performance, because this could have been such a macho archetype. This could have been Bob. This could have been, you know, they bring in Bob as almost like a visual joke, you know, as like, here's the most ultra badass macho man in the universe, and he dies pretty much immediately. He just gets murked like almost immediately because he's so overconfident and he's just leading with his dick, you know. But then you have Mel, who is, his approach to everything is like gentleness, even-handedness, and tact. And that just makes for him a much more compelling male hero, you know, if in that sense.
Well, Bob, to me specifically, recalls TerrorVision in the Ted Nicolau pantheon. In that sequence in TerrorVision where the alien towards the end shows up to save them and immediately gets killed. Because I think
like the hyper-militarized little boy, right? Yeah.
And I think that there is some messaging there. Of course, I know that Ted Nicolau plays both of these as sort of satire and a joke, but it's also being telegraphed that there's no quick fix to real trauma. You can't just expect a savior to come and fix things. And I really like that in this movie, which is about the more grounded human stuff, that he saved that beat for here. It's like they're really trying to work through this problem. Mel calls in this CIA agent who's useless because it's like, okay, this is so much bigger than one phone call fix. And Jared, was really thinking about what you were saying about watching these back to back and the comparison of the tentpole episode versus the kind of quieter episode that follows. It's sort of that thing where at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you see Sally get on the back of that truck and she's wild, and it just kind of goes to credits. there is something super compelling about what happens at that hospital afterwards, but it's less compelling when you've just watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Right.
But on its own, if the movie starts at a hospital, maybe it's the Halloween 2 thing. Halloween 2's biggest disservice is that it followed Halloween. But the idea of a woman coming into the hospital following the attack of a slasher and her dealing with that, that's interesting. I mean, I love Halloween 2 and I love Subspecies 3, but I also know that there are certain horror fans that are like, hey, more of the same. And it's like, no, I think that if you survive too much, you're not more of the same. You will be affected.
Yeah. And I think Jared made a good point too about the introduction of some of the comic relief in this movie, which
it's just
I think
Bob
it's well
gets,
implemented. Yeah,
Bob gets like the Sonny Landham in Predator treatment of where he's just getting ready to go to war, and then you just hear him scream off screen. He's never seen again. Or Bob the Goon in Tim Burton's Batman, who's swinging blades around and then just gets like kicked out, or the guy in Raiders of the Lost Ark who's swinging the knives around and then just gets shot by Harrison Ford.
I think of the most like kind of funny recent example was Kong Skull Island. Shea Wiggum's character is getting ready to sacrifice himself. He pulls a bunch of pins on grenades, is charging towards the monster, like intending to like take it out with him, and instead the monster just swats him into the side of a mountain and he blows up by himself. Like, you know, it's a funny idea, and that's kind of what Bob is doing here too. And I don't think they overdo it with the humor here. I think a lot of horror fans tend to chafe, especially like deeper into a franchise, when they start injecting some humor into an otherwise like pretty serious franchise. Sometimes it works with like your Freddy Kruegers, and then sometimes it's just kind of cringy, like with Halloween 5. But I think this doesn't overgild the lily here. I think there's enough funny stuff. You have Ian I don't know how his name is pronounced. It's Ion, and I don't really speak any Romanian at all. So it's either Ion or Jan or something like that. But Jan Hajduk is in most of these full moon Romanian films. This is one of the few where he gets like significant screen time. But like if you look in the credits of pretty much anything, he's usually like bum number 2, thug number 6, or something like that. He's always like kind of around when they're making these movies.
He's the Romanian George Buckflower.
He is, exactly. And but he gets a lot of good time here, and they have some fun with his lack of fluency in English in a way that doesn't really feel mean-spirited, but it does feel kind of Clouseau-esque, you know, that he's a little bumbling, he's well-meaning, but again, they don't overuse him. You know, I was never feeling, he was never hitting like Jar Jar Binks levels for me, you know. Do we have anything else about Subspecies 3, or we want to transition over to Vampire Journals?
Well,
this is a very interesting one.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, you're talking about some of the Romanian actors in the movie, and one of them is an actress named Elvira Ditko. I believe. I'm not really sure how to pronounce her last name, but she comes back actually in Vampire Journals as well, and she was. I believe in this movie she's credited just as woman victim, and then in Vampire Journals, I forget but it's a similar sort of nameless character like that, but she is used again. And I think my sort of final thoughts as it pertains to Subspecies 3 are that the stuff that always resonated with me with Subspecies 2 was a lot of the nighttime stuff on the streets of Bucharest and the shadow work. And I know we talked about how that really cool scene where Denise Duff, you know, she's kind of walking in a trance and she walks into the metal club. Yeah. And it's like, it's a surreal moment. And it's just, you're totally like, you can, I don't know, I feel like Subspecies 2 transports me into living in this world, and in a way where I watch what Michelle is doing and what Michelle's going through. We gave Denise Duff a lot of praise in the first movie about how in the second movie, I should say, about how she has so much to do in the opening scenes of that movie, taking over for an established character and having to convey so much emotion with no dialogue.
Yeah.
And it's like you have to know exactly what she's thinking and feeling and be on her side. And I think she does. And there's so many times when it's kind of the cat and mouse between Andis Hove and Denise Duff, and the camera's just kind of following around them around the city at night. And that's the stuff I gravitated towards the most. I think my biggest knock, because one thing I should say is we didn't really talk about Mummy. We didn't really talk about
Again,
Pamela Gordon
we should shout her
as
out, 'cause
Radu's mom.
that remains a really incredible special effect, like,
It
because Pamela Gordon as a person is very petite, and so the effect is kind of like she looks like a puppet, but you can tell it's a real person. And there's some really gooey, like, nasty makeup effects on her. She still looks great.
This is
The
a shout
special
out
effects here
again.
remain top notch.
Yeah.
Like, this is still Dave Allen. I mean, the subspecies of the title has now been reduced to like a single shot at the end of the film. Like, we talked to Ted about this and how, like,
Which bookends 2 and 3 nicely, because
It does, yeah.
2 starts with the scene where you see the titular subspecies for the only time in the entire movie, and then you
Yeah.
get them again at the very end with the Bloodstone, and I think that's a nice bookend.
And this is the last subspecies movie where we get subspecies.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. This is the very last time we see it. And that was we talked to Ted about that, and he's just like, that the Tiny Terror thing was always kind of more Charlie's thing, and as he gave me kind of more and more independence, like over in Romania, spearheading these movies. And it does need to be said again that the Subspecies series really is Ted's baby. Like, he wrote and directed all of them. He really has creative control over the direction of them. So I think he wanted to phase those out. He was more intrigued by, like, the gothic vampire story and less by, like, the little monsters. And they were also probably pretty expensive and complicated to execute, especially in the first movie.
Those were David Allen, like you mentioned, but I also want to give a shout out to Wayne Toth and Norman Cabrera, who were the makeup special effects artists working in Romania with the actors. The actors had nothing but great things to say about those guys, and they did a really fantastic job. Watching in the video zone, watching Pamela Gordon get the prosthetics applied to her for that was really, really interesting. Just really methodical, super cool, super into what they were doing. They made something that I really think you can be proud of. And the fact that these 2 films were shot 2 and 3 at the same time means that you don't get a dip in effects quality. So there's a consistency of effect. The way the blood looks, the way the prosthetics look, the way the effects are, is consistent throughout part 3 as it is in part 2. And I think that's really one of the highlights. I think there's some pretty good gore effects. There's some excellent makeup effects. And I think this thing looks good. Like, I think Subspecies 2, I always pointed out, as I thought it was one of the best looking of the full moon movies from that period. And this looks equally as good. I just feel like if this were, the beginning of the third act of a 2-hour and 15-minute long movie, then I would go with it a little bit more. Once Bob gets the knife in the head, which is a pretty cool effect, I was right back into it again. And I think it's got a strong, at last 20 minutes or so of the movie, and the last shot with the Bloodstone, pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that, like, we've had a run of a lot of, like, early 90s Romanian full moon movies lately, and Subspecies remains the series that uses this location the best. Like, it is not an adequate substitute for New York and Dark Angel or Mandroid or Invisible, like, which are clearly meant to be more American facing projects. But this is never meant to be American. It's meant to kind of be steeped in this sort of Eastern European energy, and it really nails that. Like, I think I'm the first person to make this observation, but Romania really is like the 5th character. If you think about it, it's like a character on its own.
You should trademark that, because
I should trademark that.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody's ever
put it on a T-shirt. You're absolutely right, though. Like, Romania, the locations here, are front and center. It's very old world, which I think is probably a really good place to segue, because you have this old world gothic type vampire story with Radu, the ancient vampire. Everything is very pastoral. Even though we spend time in Bucharest, it's very, how should I say this? rural feeling in a lot of ways, and it's mostly castle location and kind of sprawling greenery. What Vampire Journals will do now is take us into a more metropolitan setting
Yeah.
for a gothic vampire movie. And so, Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about Vampire Journals?
Let's learn about it. This movie was released on February 25th, 1997, again directed and written by Ted Nicolau, and it stars Jonathan Morris, David Gunn, Kristen Serey, Star Andreev, great name, Ilinka Goya, and Dan Kondarash. Right from the jump, like from the very moment this movie opens, you're just kind of like, holy shit, this is leagues more professional looking than pretty much any full moon movie that we've seen. Like, holy shit, what happened? And what happened was a delay. And that's proving kind of the best thing that can happen for a movie is a little bit more time. You know, you get to develop your sensibilities a little bit. Now, the usual full moon bottom line on this is like, if a project gets delayed, then you play a little bit of the director musical chairs and you get moved to another project. We just encountered that fairly recently, like with Mandroid, where it just gets shuffled around and everything like that.
Yeah, and how Linda Hassani ended up with Dark Angel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That, like, it was supposed to be Jeff Burr, who then went to go do Oblivion, which then went to Sam Irvin, which then went to, so it's always shuffling around. And in this case, because Ted is so in charge of this universe, of this like subspecies adjacent universe, and the shooting that's going on in Romania, when this project got delayed, that just meant he got to take a little bit extra time to work on it. It's amazing, like, what the difference of another like month or two really does to this production. Like, it's just a real, like, this is definitely in the vein of like your Anne Rice Interview with the Vampire / Vampire Chronicles kind of gothic romance. This is a much more straightforward and conventional vampire story in a lot of ways than the Subspecies movies are. And really the connections to Subspecies are very, very tenuous in this movie. Other than the fact that it shares the same writer and director and the same general theme, we get one mention of Radu as the master of the main antagonist villain here. And then it's not until Subspecies 4 that they make the connections between this movie and that series a little bit more clear. So what we're left with is kind of an interesting standalone project that lives in the universe of Subspecies, has a lot of the same energy, but has been given a lot more time and craft, and really kind of shows off like what some of these filmmakers can do if they were just given a little bit more time and a little bit more independence.
I'm really happy to hear you approach this that way, Steve. I know this was a first-time watch of this movie for you for the show, and I was really curious to see. I know we didn't talk much about it on my off mic, and I was really curious how you were going to come in and how you were going to feel about this one, because I'll come right out and say I genuinely really love this one. This, I mean, as you mentioned, it is a more conventional vampire story than Subspecies, so I do think maybe there's tropes or limitations where someone could look at it and be like, oh, this is really stylish, but it's maybe not that original, and it's not that what's the word I'm looking for? It's not really breaking any new ground in any way. But no. I'm okay with that because I feel like this thing looks beautiful. I really love the score to this movie. I think is one of the most haunting scores that's been composed in a full moon movie. And we'll talk about different performances. And I think there is one thing I'm going to say about the performances in this movie that's going to mirror slightly how I felt in Subspecies 3. But I think Jonathan Morris as Ash is a lot of fun. I think this is a really fun performance. And, he is a memorable villain, and he just brings such a unique energy. My understanding is that he was a British comedic actor before this.
Yeah.
So this thing is just kind of a weird one,
like a West End legend over in the UK. Like he's established like a lot of significant like major musical and theatrical roles over on the West End. I was going through some of his theater catalog, and it's like, oh shit, we've been in like 6 of the same productions, just very different productions. So come at me. But yeah, no, he's great. I want to love this movie. I'm gonna come in a little more controversially. Like,
Sure.
okay, so to lead off, like we just a couple episodes ago talked about Dark Angel, and where I called that the best looking, like most professionally well made full moon movie, and it didn't get to hold on to that title very long because I think it's this. I think it is this. I think this movie is gorgeous. The HD transition that's on the Full Moon channel is unbelievably crisp. It looks amazing. I think they took a lot of time with lighting, orchestration, camera movement. There's just a simple shot of like the main actress playing piano on an empty stage, and like the light is surrounding her, and just the camera movement as she's playing. And it's gorgeous. And you can tell it's not like a synthesizer this is being played on. This is fully orchestrated music. They gave them a lot more time and leeway. I think the performances are all very good. Like, genuinely, I think everybody's quite good in this movie. I think I just bump against the genre entirely. I am just left so cold by these overly maudlin, like, vampire romance stories, you know? Like, I was never a fan of Anne Rice for that reason. Like, I could never really get into Interview with the Vampire. I found it so boring. And I think I'm just running into some of the same issues here, where I can recognize that this is exceptionally well executed, but just its existence kind of leaves me cold, you know, like Subspecies injected more horror into it and more weirdness into it. And this one's just so conventional that I struggled with it a bit.
I don't disagree with that statement. However, I'll just come right out and say, I guess I have a soft spot for horny vampires.
Fair. You know, I get that. I understand that.
Yeah, I don't think that Anne Rice's influence on this one can be denied. I do believe that the Subspecies movies, if that was Full Moon kind of doing Hammer horror, this is them fully leaning into the legacy that Anne Rice brought to the world of vampires. And I think even the tenuous connection to Subspecies in this movie is very much in her vein, because we've got the main Vampire Chronicles, but if you look and see how she constructed those books with Louis and Lestat and everybody, there's so many spin-offs where it's just a passing mention of one vampire, and then they get their own 900-page book over
Michael,
here.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but this made me just think of in Subspecies 3, I got a kick out of Kevin Spiritus as Mel reading about Vladislas, the king from Part 5, who he will then play in the prequel.
Oh, right.
It was a nice little, it's kind of fun to hear him talk about the character he would later play, probably with no knowledge that would ever be the case. Sorry, continue.
Well, no, but I think that that's a testament to the world building that Ted Nicolau is doing here, even if unintentionally, right? The idea that he clearly loves Gothic horror and Gothic vampire stories and Gothic romance. And to your earlier point about getting away from Charlie's interest in tiny terrors and spooky little things and fully making this his own, I think by the time we hit the stride of vampire journals, you're really seeing Ted Nicolau say, this is what I want this franchise to be. Because in some ways, vampire journals sets the tone for what 4 and 5 become as well, too. And it's not just characters that overlap. It's more of that, the sympathetic vampire archetype, the mournful vampire archetype, the fact that Radu, while an arch villain, gets more and more relatable. Like, we understand that he is not without his good aspects, I guess. I mean, the franchise never asks us to sympathize with Radu in the way that we know he's a baddie. But it gives him a little bit more depth. And we see that starting to happen at the end of Subspecies 3, as we talked about, but really getting in here and making this whole movie about one vampire who's sort of against another vampire, while there's this community of vampires who sort of disagree. And it's all about a woman who's playing the piano. And it mirrors Michelle's story in a different way. And I think that that's really interesting.
This movie has, in its credits, there are 2 sections of credits that jumped out to me during the end credits, which I think sums up what this movie is really going for and what it does well. And the 2 subsets of credits were people credited as decadent vampires and stunning women.
Hey, that's all you need. That's all you need. Maybe should we change the title of this podcast to just Decadent Vampires, Stunning
Decadent
Women?
Vampires and Stunning Women.
I
I'm
mean,
for it. Can we commission someone for some new artwork?
Yeah,
To the point.
describes everything that's going on with this show. Yeah, but no, I really did love Club Muse, like this whole concept of this horny secret vampire society where like the main vampire villain is not presiding over like a castle like in some dark mountains. He is running a brothel for the rich and powerful, basically. That's a fun concept. I loved all the kind of stock familiar characters that he has that sort of surround him and protect him and insulate him from the outside world. And these very campy like minions that he has. That
My favorite part of the movie are Ash's minions, all of them. And that's what when we were saying before about how maybe, we spend some time with Mel and Becky in Subspecies 3, but really Michelle and Radu and Mummy, like the bad guys, are sort of the more compelling part. Here, it's what I think. Like, I genuinely Star Andreef as Iris, who is his underling, I think is a really fun performance. But I love Elinka Goya as Cassandra. I think Cassandra is one of my top 5 favorite Full Moon characters to this point.
I want to see her in more stuff. We've seen her before in Lurking Fear, I think, and it was a very small part in that. But she's so campy and she's so fun, and she kind of has the same energy that Vandella has in the Oblivion movies. Like I could see her slotting into those roles, or hey, put her in Mortal Kombat Annihilation.
Yeah, I was going to say the triumvirate of amazing horny Full Moon characters is like Cassandra, Lash, and Jacqueline Lavelle in Head of the Family.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's the Mount Rushmore of horny Full Moon ladies. Yeah, no, they're so much fun. All of that stuff is great, and I think they found the not so subtle metaphor for vampirism with sex and addiction. Obviously that's a case with vampire movies like throughout time, but forgive my crassness, but the blood spatter in this movie is very orgasmic in its execution. It's always like really pronounced and really sudden, and it always accompanies a loud sigh of relief. So they're not being subtle about what they're trying to convey with some of these things here. But despite, I think the performances are good. I did think the main heroic character was just a little dull for my taste. Because I don't know. Brooding vampires are just no fun for me. It's not fun to watch a character like brood forever and ever. Like even like Angel on Buffy got to have some moments of levity, and got to have a little bit of fun, and this guy just doesn't really get any of that. It's sort of an unforgiving thing to ask an actor to play, but it's also just not really fun for me to watch.
But it's also, to your point, Angel got his moments, but anytime any other vampire would show up, they were always more exciting, right? Because his whole thing was he wasn't allowed to be happy. It's I guess, in many ways, the Batman principle. We all like Batman in theory, pop culturally speaking, but he's not exciting. He's not a fun person. What makes a Batman movie is the dynamic craziness of his villains.
Yes.
And I think because you are absolutely right. Brooding for 90 minutes or 2 hours and in some change is not exciting in of itself.
No.
You need someone to kind of look at that person and say, hey, why so serious? I didn't set myself up for that. No,
need them to ask about how they got these scars. Just out of curiosity.
But what I do think is interesting, even though the blood splatter is not subtle and some of the affectations that are very Full Moon are not subtle, in the Full Moon catalog, this movie is very anomalous. I think that it is truly a more quiet film.
Yeah.
It's definitely almost borderline art house for Full Moon. And so the fact that it even happened is shocking, because I think we know that even though Ted is the driving force of this franchise, when it comes to the House of Full Moon, what Charlie Band says is often law. And this does not seem to me like the kind of movie that Charles Band usually puts front and center for this label. Mm-hmm. So the fact that he kind of just said, go for it, and we get this thing that's so counter to what we normally expect a Full Moon movie to be, even if it didn't work, which for me it does, but even if it didn't work, that kind of makes it an outlier and special because we don't get this very often.
We really don't. No, we really don't. And for it to come out during the Kushner-Locke era is interesting too, because this is an era that's been pronounced by reduced budgets, reduced production times, and often reduced quality. I would argue we found some of our like most fun, like bad shit movies during this era. Everything from like The Creeps to Blood Dolls, you know, like we find some really bizarre, fun stuff in this era, but it is usually fun because it's so slapdash and weird. And this is not slapdash or weird. This is conventional. Like you said, it's an art house film within the Full Moon oeuvre, which is really interesting to see that happening.
Well, something you said earlier that I wanted to cycle back to was about the delays being a benefit to this film.
Yeah.
And it's not an unusual thing for a filmmaker to say. I'm sure you've even heard this before, but there is sort of a cliche statement in the world of independent film that when you're making an independent film or a low budget film, there are three things: time, money, and quality, and you get to pick two.
Right.
So, and in this case, it actually is true.
Yeah.
They didn't have a lot of money, but they got the time, so they got the quality. And by not doing the director shuffle, he got to make a really, really lush movie.
He did.
I mean, there are sequences in this that I just think anytime we see an establishing shot with the snow, for example, I think this movie really, really captures the city and the setting so beautifully in ways that some of the other movies, while shot in Romania, would have kicked us through, and we wouldn't have gotten the time to really like live in. And that's because he had the time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of, you know, that one of the more iconic, like bizarre moments that I've encountered on this show is Subspecies 1, that live like parade, that funerary parade that is going through the town at night. Just one of those like beautiful, weird moments that could only happen in this part of the world. And this is a franchise that really lets you live in it and really lets you kind of experience how strange and beautiful and unusual it is. And this movie shoots it like it's Dr. Zhivago. Like, you know, it's not with the same level of quality, you understand, but like with that same kind of reverence. You know, it's really trying to appreciate the surroundings and highlight it as I'm going to say it, the fifth character. No one said that before.
God damn
Romania.
it. Michael, are you looking
No.
for a co-host job? Because I got to get this guy out of here. No, when I first watched this one, watching it for this recording was not my first time watching it, but I did watch it for the first time not too long ago, just on a whim. I said, you know, I really enjoy the Subspecies series. I never really got to watch Vampire Journals. My understanding is that it's held up in pretty high regard comparatively. It does seem like a weird one-off or an anomaly, so let me see what it's all about. It's 1997, so we're getting into, like Steve mentioned, that early beginning of the Kushner-Locke period, and it's like, I don't really know what to expect, because I was expecting, I think initially, something that went so polar opposite of the artistry and gothic nature of the Subspecies series to this point, and I was dead wrong. And like, just from the opening shots of, you know, some of the religious statues in the snow to the title cards and the score, I was like, oh wow, like this intro is pretty beautiful, pretty haunting. And then, you know, the first scene happens and it's, you see Ash overlooking his, you know, beloved being taken, and I was like, this is really well shot, this looks gorgeous. And then it just really continued from there. I mean, there are elements of it, obviously, I think, that don't hold up entirely or could have done without. I mean, obviously there's a lot of voiceover in this movie, which probably doesn't help. I will say better job still than Harrison Ford, but they didn't need it.
I do go so back and forth on narration, you know, like, but they make the point in Dave J's book that it feels weird to have narration in a horror film. Like it fits for a detective story, it fits for like a comedy. It feels weird in a horror film.
Right. If it's Fred McMurray giving the voiceover,
yeah,
you know, Double Indemnity, that makes sense. And Robert Mitchum giving the voiceover in Out of the Past, that makes sense. Here, it's sort of like, just let us watch. We'll figure out what's going on.
But I think that's where that Anne Rice influence comes in, right?
Yeah.
The idea that Louis narrates Interview with a Vampire. This is called Vampire Journals. So I think that we are to assume that we are being read to.
Yeah.
But
that's a good point. Actually, like I wasn't even when the voiceover was going on, I was kind of like, this seems egregious, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it does sort of make sense if the movie's called Vampire Journals, that someone would be journaling to us.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah. No, it definitely makes sense within the context of the universe, but it does throw you off. And again, I'm not a voiceover hater or anything like that, but your mileage may vary in that one element on this movie. But again, I just have nothing but praise for the execution of this and like a lot of the intention and everything that's going. And if I don't love it, like that's just on me, like having some kind of like blocks with this genre of horror fiction. It's just something that's never appealed to me, but I can respect the hell out of what they did here. And it is truly like the best looking full moon movie. I doubt we're going to find another one that looks as good as this.
Yeah. Shockingly good, as a matter of fact, given when it came out.
Yeah.
Like if you would have said that this was shot currently with Subspecies 2 and 3 and released, late 94, I'd be like, okay, like that makes sense. But given the direction things would go and how, a lot of these movies would look, a lot of the movies, even the ones we've recommended, we've really liked aspects of them in spite of how they look. But I do think from 95 to 97, 98, we do get a couple of standouts, and this is one of them. And I praised the score before because I really do love the score. It is Richard Kosinski who composed this score, and if anybody who's listening knows where I can get this on, if it was ever made available on vinyl, I would love to know. So please reach out to us because it's something that I'd like to add to my collection if it's available. It might not be. I mean, I think at this point, 97, they were still doing video zones, but I know, I don't think Charlie Spradling was there looking to sell me a Vampire Journals cassette tape, unfortunately.
Well, maybe you asking for it will prompt them to put it out.
I hope that's the kind of, influence and sway that I have in this industry. So I hope so.
Look, what else are we doing this podcast for, if not power? Well, do we have any final thoughts about Vampire Journals or Subspecies 3 before we close the book on this chapter?
Well, I will say that I really love Vampire Journals, and I think this thing toes the line between sleek, pensive, artful, beautiful, campy, ridiculous in a way that I can really get behind. And I don't dislike the brooding vampire subgenre of horror so much. I was really brought into this movie. I was like, wow, I want to live, in the world that this is creative. We didn't talk about some of the other side characters. We talked a little bit about Iris and Cassandra, who I genuinely loved in this film. But there's also like two other kind of minions that are in this movie to Ash. And I thought it was funny. There's the one of them is Dimitri, who sort of has this like weird Gil Chesterton from Frasier meets Peter Lorre energy.
Sure.
Which I appreciated. And then there was another one, Anton, who's the one who I feel like was the one who was trying to flee the country, who I think looks kind of like Angelo Badalamenti.
Sure, yeah.
And I liked just the energy that they all brought. I do agree that I feel like the movie was at its best when we were at Club Muse with Ash and all of these underlings. And again, I really loved the performance of Cassandra, just one of my favorite characters. Was so captivated, especially the scenes with her and Ash together were some of my favorite in the movie. And so, Michael, we talked when you were on the show last time. We went into your history with horror and low budget movies. And so we didn't need to revisit that. But I guess just like for posterity's sake, like when you think of Subspecies 3 and vampire movies, and you're really well versed in Charles Band and Full Moon stuff, like where do these sort of rank for you in the pantheon of all of the, not just the Subspecies movies, but Full Moon stuff in general? Like these two that we talked about today. I know Subspecies 2 is one we all held really high. So I'm curious if there's a drop off to you here, or do you kind of lump this all in as just like really good stuff that shouldn't be missed if you're seeking out Full Moon?
I think that these still are very near the top of what Full Moon does, not just for the Subspecies franchise, but in general. And a lot of that has to do with the meticulous planning of Ted Nicolau. I really can see his hand in storytelling here. And just the world building. It's not that we don't get world building in some of the other franchises in Full Moon, but sometimes it's a little kookier or a little more off the cuff. I think that even though Vampire Journals feels like an anomaly when you watch it the first time, especially following off of the heels of Subspecies 3, you can see a trajectory. You can see a narrative that's starting to take shape, not just for the characters, but for the world. The idea that now we get to see a different kind of vampire, a different kind of vampire society outside of Radu and his mother and the creatures at the castle that we have seen in the last 3 films, showcases that this is so much bigger than just Michelle and Radu, but it also is sort of Ted's way of telegraphing to us that Radu is still so unique and is like anomalous. He is a outsider in a world of outsiders. And I think that knowing that Ash comes from Radu, but he's still this sort of like pretty boy, cosmopolitan entrepreneur, and Radu is still like this Nosferatu creature of the shadows, it bridges 2 very different kinds of worlds. And we do explore in later movies, but that's not the movies I'm here to talk about, why Radu is different. But I love that the seeds are being sown this early. And so I think that when I think of Subspecies as a franchise, I kind of collectively put them all together because it's a narrative that spans over the course of numerous movies. And to that end, when I compare it to other films in the Full Moon catalog, it's always going to be up at the top because I hold them all in high regard. Some pieces more than others, but they are pieces of one big cohesive tale.
Well, we were very excited to get you back to talk about the next final chapter. Hopefully, we can close out Subspecies with you and kind of go the whole distance here because
I think there's a good connection also between Vampire Journals then and how Subspecies has been closed out to this point, at least. I mean,
yes,
for all we know, there could be more Subspecies in the future. Subspecies 5 was met with a lot of anticipation and was well received by people who saw it theatrically and on streaming. And so, I don't have any notions that we've necessarily heard the end of Radu's story. We did kind of gloss over, we didn't mention in talking about performances, just I feel like it would be a disservice if we did the whole episode and didn't at least say something about the performance of Sophia, who the actress's name, I'm not sure, it's Kirsten Sari. I'm not sure how to pronounce
Erre. Sarah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, but I think she was pretty good.
She's very good. She's very expressive. She's very I don't know. I really liked her performance a lot.
Yeah, we sort of we got into talking about the performances of the leads, and then we kind of shifted to talking about the minions, and we talked a little bit about Zachary, but we kind of left Sophia out, and she's sort of the inciting incident for the conflict between these two. But I thought that actress's performance was pretty good, and she was expressive, like you said, and I liked her, and I didn't want anyone listening to think that we didn't speak about her because we thought it was a bad performance. I know we said we thought we enjoyed the performances overall, but I do think that it's worth mentioning that she's pretty good.
Oh, I would have been interested in seeing her continue like a la Michelle, and become sort of an integrated part of the series because I thought she was very compelling. Yeah. And it's a thankless role. It's a thankless role to have to be kind of this delicate, MacGuffin basically for a battle between a bunch of like vampire pimps, it's a weird position to put her in, but she's very graceful and very dignified. I thought she was awesome.
No, what I like about her, because I mentioned this earlier, she is in many ways sort of a counterpart to Michelle in this, to the audience surrogate, as it were. But I think smartly, she is not characterized in a similar way as Michelle. Michelle is a very different person than Sophia, and Sophia's reaction to the world of vampirism is very different than Michelle's. And I think that this is all quite smart. Again, going back to my comment on Ted Nicolaou's prowess for world building in this franchise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that that closes the journal. We can wrap up this episode. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming back and for lending your expertise on this. Where can people find all of your many exciting projects that you're working on?
Well, you can always just keep up with me at Michael Varrati, both on Twitter and Instagram. Midnight Mass comes out every other Wednesday, wherein I am joined by my co-host Peaches Christ, and we talk about cult cinema. And as this episode is coming out later in the summer, I have a feature film that I wrote and directed called There's a Zombie Outside, which is going to start rolling out at festivals at the end of August into the fall. So if you're around, come see it.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, I'm sure if you see it, you will love what you see. And if you love what we do, jump onto Apple Podcasts or Spotify, drop us a 5-star rating and maybe a brief review if you feel so inclined to do so. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow us on, just about every social media. We're on Instagram at puppetmasters_castlefreaks. You can follow me at _Giallo_Jerry or Steve at Minotaur Matador. You can email us at puppetmasterscastlefreaks@gmail.com if you want to just give us some insight into things that maybe you have some background information about some of the productions, or, we messed something up and said false information and you want to correct us. We always accept that kind of feedback, and it's just nice to hear from people who are listening to the show. And you can also find our episodes on YouTube, as well as profiles for the show on X, Threads, Blue Sky, all kinds of places if you just search the name of the show. But we are not the only show that Steve is plugging. Steve, what else have you got going on?
Well, I have a show called Cinema Arcade where we play video game, or we watch movies and play the video games based off of those movies. So currently, we are far ahead of where our recording schedule for Cinema Arcade. So I'm not sure exactly where we are when people are listening to this, but we just wrapped up a double series on The Italian Job, both the original and the remake, which is a lot of fun. And we've got an episode coming up this week on The Chronicles of Riddick, which is one of the most requested games we've had to talk about. A surprisingly excellent game for a decidedly mediocre movie. So definitely check that out wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to check us out next week, because we're going back to the pre-Empire days, the movie that kind of helped launch the Empire in a lot of ways. We're talking about 1982's Parasite. And I'm sure we're going to be very normal about it. We're not going to talk about Demi Moore at all. It's going to be really fun. And we've got a very exciting guest lined up to be on that show as well. So that should be a really good time.
Yeah. So make sure you tune in next week for Parasite. We will unfortunately only be bringing you the show in 2 dimensions. But just know that if you were experiencing us theatrically, it would be Parasite 3D. But
and if you think about it, that third dimension is like the 5th character of that movie.
Damn it!
If you really think about it.
All right, so make sure you join me and whoever my replacement co-host is next week, where we talk about Parasite. See you then.